Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for joining us this evening and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsor, Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe and WBUR, whose General Manager, Charlie Kravitz, is here with us tonight. In scanning the list of past Nobel Peace Prize recipients, I counted 11 former winners who've spoken from this stage, including Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, Presidents Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, Kofi Annan, Lema Gobi, Shireen Ebadi, Desmond Tutu, among others. To make it an even dozen, how honored we are tonight to have with us the 2007 co-recipient of the world's most prestigious peace award, former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore. This year marks the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's timeless speech on the quest for peace, the commencement address at American University, in which he reminded us that we need not accept the view that mankind is doomed, gripped by forces we cannot control. Quote, "Our problems are man-made," JFK stated. "Therefore, they may be solved by man. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again." It is in this same spirit that Al Gore has led the effort to fight global climate change. From his earliest days in public life, he's been warning us of the promise and peril of emergent truths, no matter how inconvenient they may be. And he consistently reminds us that we have a choice. We can be swept along by the powerful currents of technological change and economic determinism, or we can build the capacity for collective decision-making on a worldwide scale to solve the man-made challenges of our time. In his new book, The Future, which is on sale in our museum store and the Vice President will be signing after this forum, he surveys our planet's beclouded horizon and offers a sober but ultimately hopeful forecast for our future. Our moderator this evening is Graham Allison, Douglas Dillon Professor at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Allison has served our nation with distinction in a number of roles in the Department of Defense and was twice awarded the department's highest civilian award. He's perhaps best known for his book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, and is an international expert on current efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism. Dr. Allison will be posing a few of your written questions at the conclusion of the conversation, so please submit them to my colleagues. There's a family connection in this historic moment, for as you may know, Vice President Gore's father, Senator Albert Gore Sr., served in both Congress and the Senate with John F. Kennedy, and was actually present at the dinner party where JFK was first introduced to Jacqueline Bouvier. In a memorial address delivered after JFK's death, Senator Gore spoke words that could be used to describe his son's work today, praising John F. Kennedy's lofty ideals, his eloquence, and sentiments expressed in a manner that inspired all mankind, which are now a precious part of the heritage of our land. Let me close with one of those sentiments articulated at American University in keeping with tonight's theme. In tackling global challenges, President Kennedy urged us to focus on practical, attainable goals, quote, based not on sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, drawing attention to our common interests and to the means by which our differences can be resolved. For in the final analysis, JFK concluded, our most common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in welcoming to the Kennedy Library two men whose tireless efforts continued to promote the common interests of our planet, Al Gore and Graham Allison.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Todd. It's a great honor to be here, especially with the former Vice President and a great leader, and in his post-political period, a great thinker who's been able to capture, I think, more insight in about the complexities of the environmental challenge, in the inconvenient truth, but now in this new book, which is even more ambitious, The Future, than most anybody, I would say. This book is audacious in its ambition and classic Al Gore, just basic, courageous in jumping in to extremely complicated topics and trying to get his mind around them and then present them in a manner that's accessible to us as readers as we try to think about the major, particularly scientific and technical developments that are drivers to the future. The book has 6 big lumps of drivers. Economic globalization that give us Earth Inc., the digital revolution that's producing a global mind, the shifts in international power, including some particularly painful facts about the United States, the unsustainable consumption that, this is now my editorializing, is the primary American religion. Okay? The life sciences revolution, of which Boston is the epicenter, and is in some sense one of the most exciting and and least understood. And finally, this all as it relates to the disruption of the ecosystem that we depend on for survival. Well, there you are in one book. I would say, hold your breath. Okay, this book is relentless, is densely packed but easily readable, and is challenging in every chapter. So, as a professor who actually directs a center at Harvard called the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, I live in the middle of this conversation regularly, but see nobody who would be of our system who would be courageous enough to bite off all of these different issues and try to get himself around them, understand them, and figure out, well, okay, so what might they mean for the future next year, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and how do they interact, and then where does that leave us as citizens? So, in any case, I would say a great read. Al, if you were giving your elevator version of the book, what would you say?
Well, I would start by thanking Tom Putnam and the JFK library staff and foundation here. Thank you all very much for hosting us this evening. A lot of good friends here, too, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the signing afterwards, and I look forward to getting a chance to respond to some of the questions that some of you will write and give to the staff here. So the elevator version, you kind of gave it a minute ago. We've never lived in a period of history with so many extremely powerful revolutionary changes unfolding simultaneously. And all of us have had the experience of seeing on the news or reading in a magazine about some of the startling developments in the genetics and life sciences revolution, or some of the new advances in artificial intelligence and supercomputers, or seeing some startling facts about the rise of China and the resorting of political and economic power relationships in the world. Climate stories, particularly this past year, the hottest year in the history of the United States. And yet, all of them are part of the same period of unprecedented change. And how do they all fit together? That's what this book is all about. There is a sub-theme in the book about the way in which we as human beings approach the future There is in the introduction a history of the idea of the future and how our thinking about the future has evolved and changed over time. And in the conclusion, there is an agenda of proposed solutions for many of the problems that are coming at us and ideas for seizing the opportunities that are presented by these dramatic changes. There's so many places to start. One fact, the human species, according to the scientists, emerged in roughly our modern form around 200,000 years ago. And it took 200,000 years before we reached a population of 1 billion on the earth. And we've added that many people in the first 13 years of this century. And we'll add another billion in the next 13 years. And another billion still in the 14 years following that. So in less than 1 century, we've quadrupled human population. But that's just part of the backdrop for the incredible changes that some of which are driven by developments in science and technology, others of which are driven by social and political and economic changes. And my goal in this book has been to show how all of these drivers of global change fit together and what the choices are that they confront us with, and to suggest how we might best respond.
Well, it's a big agenda. We could take any one of the arenas and spend the whole time on it. But let me just, for here in the JFK Library, Politics and Government, Chapter 3 is about the changing balance of power within the world, but also within the U.S., and the U.S. role in the changing balance of power. So if you were to think about Washington today, I think mostly, if you had to summarize it in one word, people would say dysfunctional.
Sclerotic.
Sclerotic. Okay. Now, you describe this in your book, okay, and you say that the U.S. government has been hacked.
Our democracy has been hacked.
Okay. And that corporations have basically captured the U.S. government. You argue because the flow of money and lobbyists means that bills that are harmful to the big corporations can't be passed, and many bills are passed to advance the interests of large corporations. And that citizens would object to this and do when they know about it, but that their ability to voice them, to express themselves in a way that has sufficient impact is moderated or dampened by corporate ownership of the media. And so when I get through that, it reminds me a whole lot of oligarchy, if I'm back in the Greek world, or Manker-Olson's analysis that basically over time small groups get themselves organized, dig themselves deep tunnels to the Treasury, manage to use that funding that they get to sustain their position. Well, that sounds like sclerotic, okay, or dysfunctional. So first tell a little bit more about the diagnosis, because the question, it sounds fatal. So if it's not fatal, then what's the other idea? Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's fatal, and I think there are some hopeful trends in this chapter, in this where this issue is concerned. I am very optimistic about the impact of the rising internet-based political communication that once again makes participatory democracy accessible to individuals and elevates the role of ideas and reason and logic once again. When the U.S. was founded, it was during the age of the printing press, and indeed the print revolution led to both the Enlightenment and the scientific and technological revolution, and after a few centuries, the Enlightenment's fullest flower bloomed here in New England and in the other colonies of colonial America. But we have seen dramatic changes during the life of our nation. And even though the age of the internet is still in its infancy, still coming, we are dominated now by the medium of television. 75 to 80% of all the money spent in campaigns is, by both parties, is spent to purchase 30-second television commercials. And it's a one-way flow of information. You can talk back to the TV, but it doesn't hear you. And Americans now watch television 5 hours a day on average. People my age and older watch it 7 hours a day, literally true. And, if you played tennis 5 hours a day, you'd develop some impressive muscles. If you watch television 5 hours a day, what muscle are you exercising? Not the democracy muscle. And because the conversation of democracy is so different in this age, it requires politicians, whether elected and running for re-election or candidates challenging incumbents, to spend most of their time, at least 6 hours a day, raising money by begging special interests to give them money so they can build up a war chest and scare other candidates off and have the money to buy the television commercials. So the change that's come about is not that complicated. It's actually very simple. I remember when I first went to the House of Representatives in the 1970s, I was so thrilled by the privilege of having the experience carved out by our founders to take messages from my constituents to the seat of government and to go there and work and fight in their behalf for their best interests. And there's never been a perfect golden age of American democracy, of course, but I felt this, and it's so real. And when representatives keep a weather eye out for what their constituents are thinking and feeling and pay attention to what's going to best serve their interests, then that's the essential formula that makes representative democracy work. Now, by contrast, today, when senators and congressmen spend 5 to 6 hours a day begging rich people for money and begging lobbyists for money, inevitably, the following day when they go to cast votes or when they start to make speeches, they are going to spend more time and energy thinking about the impact on their donors than they spend on their constituents, particularly if these same special interests and business lobbies and other special interests are flooding their constituents with advertising that, when you see one of these ubiquitous coal ads on TV, the purpose of that ad is not to make you say to your wife, honey, I'm going down to the corner and buy some coal. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to give you a political impression that things are pretty good with the coal industry, and maybe global warming's not such a problem, and they've got our backs. And so as long as the public is thus anesthetized, then it's safer for the politicians to pay careful attention to the special interests and less attention to the public interest. And the ideology of the right wing now includes one tenet that actually there is no such thing as the public interest. And so that's why I say our democracy has been hacked. Its operating system has now been turned to serve purposes other than those designed by our founders, and we have got to reclaim it. I think in the internet age, we are going to find significant new opportunities to save it.
Okay. Well, this is an extremely big claim and one worth all of us as citizens thinking a lot about. I find it compelling. I think there's, if you look at the argument of Menker Olson or of another fellow at the law school now, Lawrence Lessig, he's got another version of this, but similarly, in which basically the flow of funds that are essential for the buying of the ads, which are essential for winning political power, is the driver.
Yeah, and Menker Olson, who wrote decades ago, states the premise a little bit differently, that in any society, there is naturally inequality, because capitalism depends on inequality and human nature produces inequality. But over time, if there are not winds of change and waves of reform, there is a kind of an ossification of a stable system that makes it vulnerable to those with more wealth and power and privilege to turn the operations of the government and the bureaucracy to their advantage. Now, the U.S. has been less vulnerable throughout most of our 2 centuries of history and more to that process, because when our democracy is operating in a healthy way, it produces these waves of reform. And when the public is aroused by perceived injustice and unfairness, then they have a way of getting action. An economist told me one time, he was actually the president of Bolivia, had been an economist. I'm going to draw an analogy. He said, Al, you'll always have inflation, but you've got at all costs to avoid the hyper variety. And by analogy, I would say we're always going to have inequality, but we have to avoid the hyper variety. And we're getting into the hyper variety now. Since the Great Recession, 93% of the national income increase has gone to the wealthiest 1%. You look at the Walmart founding family. Lovely people, Sam and Bud Walton. Between them, they have 5 children, 1 daughter-in-law. Also lovely people. This is not a criticism of them. But those 6 people in the second generation have more wealth than the bottom 100 million Americans. The level of inequality in the U.S. is now worse than in Egypt, worse than in Tunisia. And it is unhealthy for both democracy and capitalism. And by the way, in the outgrowth chapter, I don't know if you want to, I don't want to jump around too much. I want to follow your template here. But the compass we use for constructing America's economic policy, same compass that every company uses and that countries around the world use, is oblivious. It does not measure the distribution of income. So that when 93% of the extra income goes to the top 1%, that is counted as as long as there's growth, according to this idiosyncratic definition that we use, that's good. If the middle class is hollowed out and people are really having trouble paying their bills, that's not picked up by this compass. It excludes environmental and other negative externalities. Pollution is ignored. Positive externalities are ignored too. Investments in art and science and music and research and development and environmental protection, education, the vast benefits that come from these positive externalities, they're not measured. The depletion of natural resources. So the compass that we're using, growth, the definition we're using, is functionally insane. And we equate it with progress. And we see it as a kind of a generalized good. If we're growing according to this metric, then everything's great. If we're not, then everything's bad. But it conceals so much. And by the way, the guy who invented this compass, GDP and the business accounts derived from it, Simon Kuznets, In 1937, when he was being honored for what was a genuine achievement, he warned. He said, do not use this as an economic guide for policy because it's deeply flawed. And he spelled out what the flaws were. But human nature being what it is, we get a shortcut and we just latch on to it to avoid having to go back and think through from first principles again. And so we're using this guide that is the compass needle points over the edge of a cliff.
Let me take you one more level on this one. So I recently have published a book with another guy on Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, congratulations.
And basically it tries to take out his strategic nuggets.
Right.
So he looks at China and the U.S. So that's what I want to ask about China and the U.S. And he looks at the American political system, and his analysis of it is very similar to yours. Probably he's been listening to you over this time, and watching.
I doubt that,
No, but the proposition that money democracy has led to a combination of corruption, even though it's, quote, legal corruption, and paralysis.
Yeah.
And he compares this with China, which he's looking over his shoulder, because he's trying to survive as a little tiny city-state that lives in the interstices. And while he's got a very good analysis of the weaknesses of China, he observes that if you were to measure not the process of government, but the performance, and just look at the last 30 years, the average well-being of American broad middle class has either been stagnant or even declined in some areas. And in China, 600 million people who were extremely poor have become not quite so poor. And in fact, millions of people over those 30 years have seen a 100-fold increase in their standard of living, again, measured just by these benchmarks. So if you were to talk about performance relative to, rather than process, and you look at these two systems, you'd say, well, we know our system's the best, but somehow it doesn't seem to be performing. So when you look over your shoulder at other systems, the Chinese system or maybe the Canadians or somebody else, what about the performance of government?
I think that the performance of government has been very, very poor. I'm an admirer and supporter of President Obama. This is not a critique of him, but the Congress has not been able to pass a budget. They haven't been able to pass appropriations bills. When I went to the Congress, we used to have authorization bills and then appropriations bills, and first the authorizing committees became almost irrelevant. Now the appropriations committees are almost irrelevant, and everything's lumped together in one big cliffhanger omnibus deal, and we've got another one coming up in 3 weeks. I've got cliff fatigue from this dysfunctional government. It really is not working. And as for reforms, we need regular reforms because the world is constantly changing and presenting us with these new challenges. Well, there is absolutely no meaningful reform that can be passed in the U.S. Congress today unless the members of Congress first get permission from the special interests who are most affected by the proposal that's taken up. And if they dig in their heels and don't give the Congress permission, then everything comes to a standstill. And the news media plays a role as well. It's a more complicated story, but without jumping into the climate chapter, I'll just make this point that we went through a long election year and a presidential election in 2012 in a year that was the hottest ever in the history of the United States. More than 60% of the country in deep and extended drought, massive fires burning up the West, Superstorm Sandy, devastating lower Manhattan and parts of New Jersey and elsewhere. $110 billion in climate-related disaster damage. And not one journalist asked one question of any of the presidential candidates in any of the debates about the climate crisis. That is pathetic.
Okay, so actually, it's hard to believe, okay? It's true, absolutely true, hard to believe. So now we try to think, why might that be the case?
Because the special interests that are exercising such control, the same ones that are putting the constant advertising, coal, oil, and gas, and sometimes they will say, don't run this ad adjacent to a story about climate, please. And the Chinese wall, and some organizations, many protect the tradition, but in some organizations, I can tell you, the old Chinese wall between the news gathering side and the advertising side is eroding badly. And I think that's part of it. I think that it's a little bit like, the vitriolic response of the climate deniers and their ideological allies who want to shrink the size of government down to a point where it can be drowned in the bathtub, as one of them only half jokingly said, they pitch a fit when the word climate is mentioned. And so the political media culture begins to resemble the dining room of a family with an alcoholic father who flies into a rage if alcohol is mentioned. And so the learning that takes place is, let's keep the peace by not bringing up anything that's unpleasant to talk about, because there'll be hell to pay if we even mention the word climate. And meanwhile, we're destroying the future of civilization. We've got to stop doing that.
God help us. Okay. So let me I don't think we're going to fix the climate problem tonight, but I think Al's chapter on that is absolutely must-reading for sure, because it advances the conversation well beyond inconvenient truth, which was a splendid contribution. Let me go off on a slightly different angle for a second. So in the technologies and developments that you analyze as these 6 drivers, one of the problems with them is, on the one hand, many of them have huge promise, and so in some sense you're a techno-optimist, and yet there's also frightening peril. So of the drivers, which one do you think has the most promise, and which one seems to entail the most peril, and why?
Well, I talk about the exciting developments in renewable energy technology, with the rapid reduction in the cost of electricity from solar and wind, and the dramatic improvements that come from energy efficiency. Similarly, in the chapter on the global mind, the enhancement of human capacities by the digital revolution is absolutely extraordinary. And in the genetics and life sciences revolution, the potential for curing deadly diseases and alleviating horrible conditions is almost miraculous. But you're right that in each of these fields and others, there are also problems that need to be recognized and addressed. In the digital world, we now have a stalker economy, where if you go to dictionary.com right now and look up a word, without you knowing it, that business will place 234 cookies or small computer programs on your device or on your computer that will track your work on the internet, where you go and what you're looking at and so forth. And then they sell that information. And it's not only these stalker companies that treat their customers as their products, it's also government playing a new role in compiling voluminous amounts of data. And no matter how much we trust and respect and like the president who's in power at the time, we have to maintain the wisdom of our founders who told us that it's human nature to be seduced by power, regardless of politics or ideology. Too much power in the hands of the central government, in the hands of one or a small group of people, is dangerous. And in the information realm, that is happening. Similarly, in the life sciences revolution, we are now becoming the principal agent of evolution. And if we take the same short-term focus that now characterizes markets and capitalism, and we seek short-term benefits from selecting traits and splicing genes and changing the genome without taking the time to look at the longer-term consequences and effects, then that's dangerous. A quick example. Anybody here familiar with spider goats? No. Okay. Spider silk turns out to be an extremely valuable substance. Stronger than steel, very flexible and useful. How do you get it? Well, you can't farm spiders. They're aggressive and cannibalistic. But here's what you can do, and here's what's being done now. You can take the genes from orb-weaving spiders and splice them into goats. And you get spider goats. And they look like goats, but they secrete spider silk through their udders with their milk. And it's strained and captured and collected and sold. Everybody okay with that? I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but the word that comes up a lot in connection with examples like that one, and there are lots of them, is the word creepy. What does creepy mean? Creepy is not fear. It's kind of pre-fear. Something going on here. Not sure how I feel about it. Maybe I need to keep my guard up a little bit. And so, yes, what about parents selecting traits for their children? Parents can be competitive. And do you want a checklist? Some would. What about cloning people? Technically, the clone animals, I participated in hearings back in the 70s on this in the House of Representatives.
That sheep.
They said at the time, Dolly, they said at the time that it can be done with people, but there's an ethical bar in our country at least, and it's recognized, we think, in other countries. But, and again, back to China. As parents can be competitive, nations are too. China is wants to become, and some think is becoming, the world's superpower of genetic engineering. An extremely ambitious, lavishly funded program to sequence genomes and try to find the genes that are associated with intelligence, some controversy there, but it's a massive undertaking.
So in both of these arenas, you've given us a sense of fantastic promise and also somewhere, if not perilous, at least creepy, okay?
Well, questions that should command our attention.
Right.
We find it difficult to deal with the timescales associated with evolution, and yet we are now the principal agent of evolution. We find it difficult to deal with the timescales associated with the geology of the Earth. And yet we are now a geological force. Our civilization has become the most powerful force in nature. You know, we put 90 million tons of global warming pollution every day into the atmosphere as if it's an open sewer, and it obeys the laws of physics. It traps a lot of heat, and cumulatively, the man-made global warming pollution up there now traps, these are calculations that Jim Hansen and his team has done, it traps enough extra heat each day to equal the energy in 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. Now, it's a big planet, but that's a lot of energy every day. And that's what's evaporating more of the ocean water into water vapor in the sky. The warmer air holds more. The downpours and floods are bigger. The droughts are deeper. The wind speeds are stronger. Half of the North Polar ice cap is now gone in summer. The jet stream is being affected. Precipitation is now in different locations, in different timing patterns. Sea level is rising, etc. And we cannot not look at that. We have to live in the world of reality. Now, there are fantastic opportunities when we rise to confront this challenge and the others. We can make a much better world, and we can create improvements in the way of life for everyone. But it starts by looking clearly at exactly what we're facing and mobilizing to make intelligent choices.
So let me try to get you then to take the governance piece that we were discussing.
Yeah.
And let's take the environment, which we were just on. So one of the problems, as you point out very well in the sixth of the drivers, the way these things come together to impact the whole climate, is that we have 7 billion people. So each of us does our thing. And then we got a couple hundred governments. They do their thing. But each of them are, as you say, in effect, impacting this global ecosystem that one can treat like a sewer. But if I treat it like a sewer and you're very responsible, the stuff still flows.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's the classic global common issue. And the governance, I mean, if we said, how's global governance coming for global challenges? Well, if the U.S. government were dysfunctional, I don't know exactly what word I would use for global governments, but it ain't much better.
No,
so,
it's worse. I mean, it reflects the degradation of American democracy, because there is, as far as I can tell, and people I respect who look at the same issue seem to agree, that there's no alternative to the United States as a leader for the world. So the stakes are very high when it comes to fixing and reforming American democracy on a global basis. Now, there is cause for hope and optimism. There are lots of examples of a global shift in awareness, consciousness, if you will, that has resulted in change. The abolition movement, the anti-whaling movement. There are so many examples of now at long last the recognition of the LGBT community to be accepted on an equal basis in every sphere. And while we associate that with the struggles here in the U.S., the British Parliament just voted overwhelmingly today to make that change there. And it's coming in countries around the world. So as the global mind, as the digital universe empowers individuals to connect with one another, and to form groups of like-minded people committed to reforms, then I think the chances of this emerging are greatly increased. And I'm encouraged also by the young generation being so active in their communities. It's something completely different. And every one of these reform movements is really connected to the internet. It's not an accident.
I have about 99 questions, but we're going to take some from the audience. And you've written out questions.
Okay.
And you mentioned young folks. The first one comes from an 18-year-old senior at Boston College High School.
Okay.
Okay. You've been very interested in issues concerning the environment in the past 10 years or so. But has this always been a strong interest of yours? Was there a specific instance that compelled you to action?
Well, I had a teacher who Graham Allison knew, a professor when I was a student in college here, named Roger Revelle, who was the first scientist to measure CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, along with Charles David Keeling, who he selected for that project. And he was he opened my eyes to the issue of global warming. Prior to that, my mother read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring aloud to my sister and me at the table each evening for quite a while. And it's the only book I ever remember her doing that with. And earlier than that, my dad taught me lessons about soil conservation on our farm. And so for me, it was a direct line from taking care of the farmland to seeing Rachel Carson's vision and hearing her warning to what Professor Revelle revealed to his students about the global crisis that has now continued to worsen.
So you mentioned your mom, and one of the things that I found very touching in the book was the inscription dedication, in which you say, "She gave me a future, an abiding curiosity about what it holds, and a sense of our common human obligation to help shape it." So that driving curiosity, one feels all the way through the book. But how did she come to be reading Rachel Carson to you all at the dinner table? I think that was unusual. Yeah.
Yeah, she was an unusual person. I wrote this. I finished this book in the 100th anniversary year of her birth. She was one of the very first women to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School back in the 1930s. Couldn't get hired by any law firm in Nashville. They wouldn't hire a woman, so she went out to Texarkana and put up her shingle and practiced oil and gas law and divorce law. And she was always a really important part of my father's political career, and did exactly what I wrote in that dedication.
So here's another question. On issues like gay marriage or climate change, our political leaders have been way behind the people.
Yep.
As a recovering politician, do you have a better chance to affect the future as an author, investor, and thinker than as a politician?
Well, I'm under no illusion that there is any position in the world with as much of an opportunity to bring about positive change than that of President of the United States. So I have found other ways to serve, and I'm enjoying them. And by the way, as an investor, I'm co-founder of and chairman of Generation Investment Management. I co-founded it with my partner, David Blood. And incidentally, I wanted to name that business Blood and Gore, but
it would have been much more memorable. Yes.
I really did. But the other partners were a little reluctant. I thought it would have instant brand recognition.
Doesn't quite convey the message of it.
It's like an old English marmalade company or something. I don't know. But in any case, this book began 8 years ago with as someone said, the question I was asked about the drivers of global change. But a few years after that, the outline that I produced was used as one of the inputs to our investment business. And so I was encouraged and emboldened when it had real useful value in the real world. So I do think that you can help improve the world in lots of ways beyond politics. And, I didn't choose to leave the government of my own accord, but life is good.
Okay. I don't know how we have so many financial questions, but I didn't choose these here. Okay. The next one is, as owners of shares in mutual funds, how do we influence compensation and incentives of the underlying companies? We can't vote at shareholder meetings of those companies.
Yeah, that's one of the disadvantages of the mutual fund route. But let me just, mutual funds are by far the largest owners of equities in the United States. One of the trends that I point out in this book is that 30 years ago, the average mutual fund would turn over its entire portfolio in about 7 years. The average holding period for stocks was about 7 years, which was congruent with the organic process by which a company's value is built up. About 80% of the value of the typical company is built up over a business cycle and a half, roughly a 7-year period or so. And when I say it's an organic process, having helped to start a lot of businesses now and learned a lot about this, you got to put together your business plan, hire your employees, get your advertising, get your supply lines and marketing and all of that. And that just takes time. But so the 7-year mutual fund holding period was consistent. Now it's less than 6 months, not 7 years. And the short-termism in both business and politics is part of the problem that we have to face in order to really do a good job in dealing with these drivers of change. And now, talking about short-termism, one other point. On the New York Stock Exchange and on the London Stock Exchange, 60% of the trades are now done by supercomputers, high-frequency, high-speed trading. And the relevant time period is not the next quarterly earnings report, it's milliseconds. And this is one of several things I point out are creating more frequent disruptions in markets. If you think about the great credit crisis and the Great Recession just a few short years ago. And since then, we've had the flash crash where the stock market plummeted 1,000 points in 20 minutes. And nobody could figure out what had happened, or much less why. And it came back mostly. But they appointed a forensic group, and it took them 5 months to get to the bottom of it. One of the members of that group was a friend of mine and yours, Joe Stiglitz.
Oh, yeah.
And he proposed a remedy in the course of that exercise to prevent future flash crashes. He said we need a new rule that offers to buy and sell have to remain open for 1 second. That proposal was rejected out of hand amidst warnings that the entire financial system would collapse if offers to buy or sell had to remain open for 1 second. Now, that is real short-termism.
Yes, that's short. Okay. So we have another question from Boston College High School. So President Obama made history when he mentioned climate change in his recent inaugural address and the absolute truth of it. How do you think the current administration will tackle global warming in the next 4 years?
I was really encouraged by what President Obama said in his inaugural address. It was the first issue mentioned, spent more words on it than any other issue, and I was greatly heartened by that. I think he has to follow through on that, don't you think? I think that it's going to be, it would seem odd after him saying what he did not to get some real good people in the White House who knew about the issue and were going to help him mobilize to face it. I hope he'll do that. There's some things he can do without the Congress acting. Already, new coal plants will have to face limits on CO2 emissions. And the Supreme Court has taken the obvious interpretation that global warming pollution is pollution, so the law that requires limits on pollution apply to global warming pollution. And so he can do that without the Congress, although the Congress has a way to push back, and that may be something that plays out. But ultimately, where this problem is concerned, we have to put a price on carbon. We have two great, powerful tools to shape our future. One is democracy, the other is capitalism. And both systems are the best way to organize, respectively, politics and economics. They have proven advantages, but both systems are in need of reforms so that they operate truer to their principles. And where the climate crisis is concerned, the reform that's needed is to insist that all of the costs be included in the market calculations. And this idea of externalities, which is sort of like Orwell's memory hole, where you label something an externality and it's, get out of jail free card. I mean, you can ignore what's an externality. Well, we can't ignore the energy of 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs every day. We can't.
Okay, so here, another question from, I don't know if this is a high school student or not. What personal measures do you take to alleviate environmental damage? Do you drive a hybrid car? You have a compact? Support local farmers? Recycle? If you could just choose one or two measures that are most impactful for us as consumers, what would you suggest we do?
Yeah, I do. I drive a plug-in hybrid car. I have 33 solar panels on my roof. I have 7 deep geothermal wells underneath my driveway and yard. I buy only renewable electricity. I do buy local organic food and support local farmers. I flew up here on U.S. Air, and I offset the carbon emissions and all of the carbon emissions. I know some people are skeptical about using carbon offsets, but if you go about it in the right way, it does make a difference. It is one of those things that builds up these markets for renewables and carbon-reducing technologies. So I walk the walk and don't just talk the talk.
Mm-hmm. Again, this is a great audience. Okay, so I just finished the Isaacson book, this Walter Isaacson, on Steve Jobs, and learned that you were on Apple's board. One, what would Steve Jobs think about the future, the subject you address in the book? And second, what did you learn from him?
Well, a lot. We were very close friends. I first met him in the 1970s when he was at Apple in its first incarnation and co-sponsored the so-called Apple Bill when I was in the House of Representatives. It had to do with him donating computers to schools and getting a tax break for it. And when I left the White House, not long after he asked me to join the board of Apple, and I used to stay with him in his house in Palo Alto when I would go out there, and we talked about the future and just about everything else. And what did I learn from him? I learned a lot from him. If I had to, there's so many things, but I'll pick out one illustrative example. he had a really powerful sense of when to say no to a new project. Even if it was compelling and looked like it was something that might be really promising, he would evaluate how much internal bandwidth, how much creative capacity that he and his team had, and if by taking on a new project it was going to result in pulling some of that internal bandwidth away from what was needed for the top priorities, he was ruthless in saying, no, we're not going to do it. And that's one of many lessons I learned from him.
So this takes a little bit back to something we were talking about earlier, but I think it's a good question to come back to for a second. Can you comment on the concerted effort by some corporations or extreme right to challenge fundamental truths, distort and reconfigure the truth to support their agenda? How do we, citizens, respond and maintain our democratic institutions under such pressure?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important question. All of us here know the sacred saying, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. The first step in that aphorism, you shall know the truth, is something that some business lobbies have tried to hack and to interrupt. And there are a lot of examples. Let's just take the example of the climate deniers. They have stolen a page from the tobacco industry's playbook. Many of you will remember, this is a very young group largely, but some of you will remember that after the Surgeon General of the United States linked definitively smoking of cigarettes to lung cancer and other lung and heart diseases, the tobacco companies, many of them, spent a lot of money trying to confuse people about that scientific truth and to undermine the public's understanding of that scientific linkage. Well, that's exactly what the large carbon polluters, many of them, have been trying to do. Financing these bogus pseudoscientific studies, raising one red herring and straw man after another. It may, it's sunspots, they say. No, it's not. It's volcanoes, they say. No, it's not. You can go right down the list. But their purpose is to obscure truths that are inconvenient. And we see it now in a lot of other areas. But there are a lot of problems with that. Number one, it's dishonest, and it corrupts the essential magic of democracy. Because, you know, throughout history, those with wealth and power, and in some periods of time, force of arms, have been able to often have their way. And when the great mass of people who did not have power and wealth were able to say, hey, what about us? Here's some things that we need to make our lives better. The most effective way the mass of people have had to do that is by using democracy. And the reason the United States of America has been so inspiring to people around the world is that we have lived out that truth here in the United States, where people who did not have wealth and power, force of arms, could say, no, here are the facts, here's what's happening to me and my family and my neighbors and my community and all the people who have the same kind of job that I have, and we need some changes and some reforms. And so we're going to reach out and we're going to connect with others, and if you're not with us, we're going to vote you out. And if you want to be a champion for us, we'll help you get elected. And it never worked perfectly, but it worked often enough and well enough to inspire the world and to make this the greatest country on the face of this earth. Now, when this big shift happened from newspapers to television, then all of a sudden it wasn't a meritocracy of ideas. It was a virtual public square where a few had very powerful megaphones and could repeat the same messages over and over and over again, like those coal ads I was talking about earlier. And if that works, then those who are using that strategy become tempted to try to drown out inconvenient truths and to say, no, we're just going to, shut that down. And again, it's dishonest, it's corrupt, and it is the enemy, that strategy is the enemy of democracy.
Well, I think that my unfortunate responsibility is to say that we haven't come to all of the conclusions on all the topics that people raise, but we've come to the end of the conversation at this stage. And I think if you've had the opportunity to listen to the Vice President as he's thinking about this subject so actively, I think you will have sold a lot of books tonight. And when you get a book, you'll have a great read. So let's say thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Graham. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you.
My honor.
Thank you very much. I look forward to signing your books.